Hi, thank you for joining us today. I'm Fleur, I'm the marketing manager here at ProdPad, and here with me today is Jana, our CEO. She's going to talk to you today about how to grow up lean. And we're going to get, but I'm just going to cover some housekeeping. Firstly, this will be recorded and it'll be sent out early next week, so don't worry if you need to jump off or want to share this with a team member, you'll have the recording on Monday. And also, we love questions. There will be a Q&A at the end, so as they pop into your head, do put in tab and we will get to them at the end. All right, without further ado, over to you, Jana.
Great, thanks for setting that up, Fleur. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, I'm getting the thumbs up here. So let's, as Fleur said, let's get stuck in. Today we're going to be talking about growing up lean, strategies for managing your more mature product lines. Now, you all know this product lifecycle chart. And while many of us here are probably familiar with the uphill battle and the grind involved in getting traction and any growth towards product market fit, the launch and growth phases here actually represent a small fraction of the overall life of your product. The MVP that everyone talks about, well, it happens right here at the very introduction of your product. However, most of us aren't working on these greenfield, brand new products. Most of us are working on products that we've adopted from previous teams. You've probably already got a pile of existing customers and constraints. You probably have a good chunk of tech debt under there, and probably some messy backlog of features and bugs that you may never be able to fully work through. And yet, if you look at the volume of sales, it's in the maturity stage where most of the money is made. And yet, it's also where churn really hurts. See, in an early stage company, it's easy to mask an ugly churn rate, especially if you've got high growth in a frothy new market. But once you've saturated that market, your churn problem is really going to start to kick in. So it's at this maturity level where it really starts to bite back. And yet, if you look on Medium or elsewhere, you'll mostly read about launching products and optimizing for growth. There's a whole lot less shared about managing products that are actually reaching maturity, or God forbid, those decline stages. Which is a shame because it's exactly at those stages when things start to get really hard. In the growth stage, your team is focused on getting product market fit and doing whatever it takes to get traction and prove your product has a place in the world. In the maturity stage, you've got existing and new users to build for. You've got built-in constraints and technical complexity and people and politics to work around. In short, maturity comes with problems. For example, you might find that you've become a feature factory. You see, in the early stages, each new feature you built brought you more downloads, more signups or sales, and it blasted you forward beyond the competition. You were hyper agile and you pushed out new code and new features weekly, if not even daily. You outpaced your competitors and you knew how to move fast. But in the later stages, the goal isn't to just deliver new features. In fact, each new feature weighs you down, resulting in a Frankenstein of a product. So your old habits have actually led you astray. And so focus on objectives instead of features. Inherently, teams understand this. They know that a big pile of features isn't what their customers want or what their business needs. And yet it's a pattern that happens over and over again. I blame the roadmap. You see, roadmaps aren't inherently bad. In fact, they can be a great tool for communicating your product strategy. And yet, a badly done roadmap can pave the way to a feature-filled product death. And so, I implore you all to do this with me. Ditch your timeline roadmap. See, I know this format makes you look great today. Your board and your bosses certainly love when you can give them this level of certainty, but it's setting you up for failure. If you deconstruct this format of roadmap, you basically get a chart. It maps out time versus things to do, and you have this time on the x-axis, creating this timeline. And at first, it seems pretty easy and intuitive to use, especially in the short term. But the further out you plan and the more you put on there, the harder it becomes to manage. And because that timeline sits at the top, always marching forwards, no matter what you put on that roadmap, they always include a due date and a time estimate for every last feature, just by the format of this roadmap. And as a result, you end up with a big pile of features and a big pile of deadlines, and it's all based on this big pile of assumptions. The first assumption that you've made with this format is that you know how long each of these is going to take. Now, this might be easy for the stuff that you've already broken down into more detail and had the developers give some estimates for, but the further down the list you go, the less clarity you've actually got. And you're also assuming that nothing else is going to come in to mess up your timeline. No new changes in the market, no new competitors, no fresh ideas coming from your customers, no need for iteration. You're also assuming that each of these features will work as soon as they launch. Let's say you put 3 weeks into building that new checkout page, then at the end of 3 weeks, it should be converting exactly as well as expected and you're free to move on to the next thing, right? Except that not. And so finally, by explicitly adding these features to the timeline, you're assuming that each of these features should definitely exist, that they form part of the strategy and therefore should be codified. And at the end of the day, you're making one big dangerous assumption, and that's that nothing is going to change. So, what could go wrong? Well, these made-up release dates that you're putting out there are forcing your developers to go on stressful marches to launch on time, all while your sales and customers are getting expectations around things that you probably can't quite meet. At the same time, you're missing opportunities in the market and oftentimes downright building the wrong things. And this leads to you being a sad product manager. And we don't want any of this. So, is there a better way? Well, of course there is. I'm going to get you out of the feature factory in 3 steps. So, step 1, start with your vision. If you don't have one of these agreed with the team, go back to the drawing board. Now, this is a format that I'm showing here that I like using. You might actually recognize it from Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. It was an elevator pitch template that he included in his book. But I like it because it asks the right questions for product vision. Who are you building for and what's going to set you apart? So feel free to download this free template or refer to Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Come up with a vision that you can share with your team based on a template that asks these types of questions. Next step, map out your objectives. Now these should be outcome-based goals that are tied to your company strategy. You might know these under different names. Some companies call them KPIs, some companies call them OKRs, or like us, you might just simply call them objectives. It doesn't matter what you call them, it's just whatever works for you and your team. They act as guardrails and keep everyone pointing in the right direction and working on the right things. The important thing is to focus on outcome over output. Measuring output is like counting how many story points have been completed. Measuring outcome means that you're tying those results back to the original company level goals. And so finally, change that timeline out for time horizons. Instead of that single line marching forwards, think in terms of these 3 buckets. In the first, you're granular about your focus and your scope. This is the stuff that is being prototyped, tested, and built right now. Whereas the future column is much less about specific initiatives, but more around outlining the problems you think need to be solved in order to fulfill your vision. These are assumptions to be validated. And that's key. Your roadmap is for validation. Your roadmap is a prototype for your strategy. Think of it this way. Just as you might validate a feature by drawing up some paper prototypes and showing them to your customers, and then based on their feedback, starting again and again. Your roadmap is just like that. It's a starting point for the conversation around what needs to be included in your strategy. And so put those 3 things together, your vision, your objectives, and your time horizons, and you get a lean roadmap. Each of these blocks are initiatives or problems to be solved. Each one is linked to a specific objective. So here's one popular configuration. And another layout that's very similar but groups cards by objective. The value of this roadmap format is that it takes the focus off building features and hitting delivery dates and helps your team strive towards actually solving problems. And speaking of problems, nothing stifles innovation like a to-do list as long as your arm. And yet this is a state that so many teams get stuck in. Every all-in-one backlog has some massive, bloated, vertigo-inducing column of tickets that are lined up to do next. And frankly, it stresses out the development team who are looking down the barrel of a million upcoming yet undefined tasks. And it freaks out the non-tech team who are just wondering why none of their ideas ever seem to see the light of day. The solution to this is actually quite simple. Break your backlog into two parts, the product backlog and the development backlog. So backlog is a broad term, so let's be more specific. The development backlog is the stack of specs that are ready and approved for dev and are just waiting for someone to start building. It should be relatively short and tidy and allows the developers to focus on the task at hand. Your developers can pick from this list and know that they're working on the right thing and have enough information to crack on, even without your immediate input. This is your execution. Your product backlogs live separately. It includes customer requests, suggestions from the team, insights from experiments and prototypes, and more. And it should be transparent. Your whole team can search and add to it. This is where you prototype and spec out your ideas. This is where you connect them to the objectives that they're meant to hit. This backlog, your product backlog, is key to your strategy. So split your backlog into these two parts to avoid having a beast of a backlog and not getting the best of either world. And as your product matures, experimentation gets scarier. We all know this build, measure, learn diagram. You probably know it from the Lean Startup book. And you know what? It seems simple because it is simple. That is, until you've got competition nipping at your heels and a growing base of customers asking for more and more and tech debt creeping in at the edges. So your company enters panic mode and starts trying to shovel fixes and features out the door and neglects to focus on anything but the build part. And it usually happens at the expense of other crucial parts, like actually measuring and learning. And you end up with a build, build, build cycle. It's called the build trap. You can get out of this trap, though. You just need to create the time and the space to validate the work that's being done. It's not that the people in the team don't understand that it's important to move the right metrics. It's that they often don't have the permission and time to stop building and actually do the measurements. You can avoid the build trap by implementing dual track agile. Now, there's a lot of ways of interpreting dual track agile, but the essence is that you give figuring out what to build as much importance as the building process itself. So you might start with a discovery track to find out if a product idea is any good. Successful findings from that discovery track are then added to the backlog of the delivery track. So having a dual track approach gives you permission to spend time in discovery instead of feeling the pressure to constantly deliver new features. So done well, this gives you the best combination of speed and learning. Now, I see a bad habit all the time. You've released something. So you close all the tickets in Jira, you crumple up all the sticky notes from the wall, you wipe down the whiteboard, and you start moving on to the next thing. And this actually might seem good for keeping up cadence, but it's really bad for ensuring that you're actually making an impact. After all, just because something was launched doesn't mean it's actually solved the problem you wanted it to. Fortunately, your lean roadmap format can help you here. So as I said before, each card is a problem to be solved, and it's tied to an objective. Well, each card can then be connected to a list of experiments that can be run in order to solve that problem and impact that objective. You can use your roadmap to give you an overview of progress on these ongoing experiments. And once a project is done in development, don't just throw these results out or tuck them away somewhere that you'll never find them again. Instead, move them to a list of completed cards, some sort of validation roadmap. The purpose here is to give you a space to track what was released and when, and then outline the results. Did it solve the problem and move the metric you were hoping it would, or do you need to go back and try some new experiments on it? So by building this space, by building this validation into your roadmap, you create a space to show the value of the work being done. And it helps to remember that it's not your job to have all the answers. You're supposed to know less than your colleagues. Instead, you should be focusing on asking the best questions and also creating a safe space for everyone to contribute to this experimentation. To really excel with experimentation, you need to build psychological safety. It's about making people feel more comfortable speaking up, reporting failures and errors, and pitching in to help out with the product. So how do you build this safety within your own team? Well, there's a couple tweaks to your language that can actually help create the right environment. Phrase questions so they begin with, how might we? It turns the issue into a collective problem. It supposes instead of asserts. And it works really well in conjunction with, I bet. Because as a product manager, you're going to be wrong a lot. I bet gives you permission to fail and to try again. After all, it wasn't you that was wrong. It was your hypothesis. And now that you know what doesn't work, you're free to test the next bet. So it's really subtle, but these shifts in language set the stage for psychological safety. And as any product matures, it starts to create a market that looks pretty tasty to anyone just starting up. So if you're succeeding in any way, shape, or form, you're about to be disrupted. I like to think about companies on this risk appetite scale, on this continuum. So most companies start off at one end of this scale, super nimble and lean. They don't have customers or tech debt. The founders, they've probably read Lean Startup and are ready to use it in anger. Whereas on the opposite end, you've got your giants, your slow-moving companies pinned down by government regulations and obligations to existing stakeholders. Now, these slow-moving companies and these obligations that they have, this usually translates to massive piles of cash. It's nice at the top there, but they know that the competitive field is always changing. Upstarts are always chewing away at the edges, chipping away at the value that larger companies are creating. And so these larger, slower, richer companies need to be on the watch out. Otherwise, they're going to be the ones rendered obsolete. Now, the shift from nimble to slow is actually practically inevitable for any maturing product, but the most successful companies have actually found a way to compete with these upstarts. Here's a number of tactics that you can do to help compete with these startups that are coming at you. I call this one the Google. Now, everyone knows that Google is famous for their 20% time. They used to give, or still do give, I think, their staff the equivalent of 1 day a week to work on whatever they like. Now, this might seem like a colossal waste of resources, but some of their core products, like Gmail and Maps and a bunch of others, have actually come out of this type of program. Now, 20% might be too much for a lot of companies, but perhaps you can try to carve out just 2% or 0.2% and see what kind of thing comes out of it. The hackathon is just as good for building disruptive products as it is for team building. Give your team a time box week of freedom to put together a simple product. It could very well be the start of a new profitable business line. And the lab is an approach used by a lot of large enterprises, usually those going through some form of digital transformation. The lab is usually a small division of a large company that looks and acts like a startup, but has the backing of the corporate parent. So any prototype that comes out of it that shows interest, they've already got this corporate backing to fuel it and to grow it into a profitable business line down the line. And finally, the Facebook. Facebook has one of the largest user bases in the world, but they never release something to everyone at the same time. In fact, they segment their users into tiny groups to test and release new features to just one group at a time. What this actually does is removes the risk of launching and allows them to experiment way more readily as a result. And there's a lot of formats of doing this. There's tools out there that can help you provide dark launches or segment out beta groups, all sorts of tools out there to allow you to segment your users in this sort of way. And so all of these are tactics that can actually help your company disrupt your own maturing product before it enters into the decline stage. Your goal as a product manager is to breathe new life into your maturing product by either adding more value or expanding your market. And if done, you can extend your product's life and expand your revenues even further. So, you can beat the feature factory by ditching your timeline and focusing on solving real problems. You can conquer that beast of a backlog by separating the strategic parts from the execution parts of your backlog. You can learn to love experimenting again by building in a safe place for validation. And figure out how to disrupt yourself before someone else does. And that is how you can grow up lean. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions here. The first is that this person is a bit puzzled by the mention of the product backlog. Is this not the same as and it's not the same as the roadmap? Are they different levels of the same thing?
That's a really good question, and it's actually a common misconception that trips up a lot of product managers. No, your roadmap is not the same as your product backlog. Your roadmap is a high-level strategic communication document. It's how you identify what major steps you need to take or what major obstacles or problems you need to solve in order to meet your product vision. This should be a one-pager that allows you to communicate that high-level strategy. Your backlog is something different. Your backlog is a list of all the things you could do. Some of these might be ready for development and are broken down, and so this lives as your development backlog. These are just tasks to be completed, user stories to be built, bugs to be fixed. Whereas your product backlog, or if anybody here is familiar with Marty Kagan, he's the author of Inspired, and he calls it the opportunity backlog, which I really love the idea of, because it's a list of all the opportunities you have to maximize your revenues and grow your company. And these could be built out of insights and experiments and feedback from your customers and all sorts of stuff. And this is very much a two different ways of looking at it, because the roadmap is a top-down approach to product management. So you're basically saying, we want to be the X of Y. This is our vision, and here's what we're going to do to get there. Managing from a backlog is very much a bottom-up approach. Now, you can't just go top-down, because it means that you're missing out on what's going on in the market. You also can't just go bottom-up and build things based on, which features come up most frequently from your customers, for example, because that means that you're actually just building a whole bunch of features without a cohesive product strategy. The best product managers, and essentially the role of the product manager, is to prioritize looking at both these ends, tying in that top end approach with that bottom end approach. And so that slide that I showed you where the roadmap attaches to your experiments, this is essentially where your backlog is fed into your roadmap. So you can say, if we want to solve problem X, then these are the things we're going to try to do to solve that. And it's a subset of your backlog that's been pipelined into your roadmap itself and set up for development and feedback from there. So your backlog is a separate document, but it feeds into your roadmap, and your roadmap is separate from your backlog, but helps guide what kind of things go into the backlog. It's a great question. Thanks so much for that one.
Okay, cool. And there's another one here. So firstly, thank you for the great presentation, Jana. And what would you recommend for a large legacy product that is written in outdated technology? How might we move to be lean?
Oh, everyone loves a good old legacy system, right? We all have one. More often than not, it seems to be the billing system. No one ever wants to touch that. But sometimes it's our entire tech stack, and I've been in that situation more times than I'd like to admit. And the reality is that every company does hit that point, because tech gets outdated. Tech debt does pile up, and new technology comes along, and in order to keep up, you need to build on something new. So Matt's question was around, how do we actually do that? It's not an easy one, and each approach does require you to understand the context and the customers that you're going to be dealing with and what kind of tech you're talking about. So I'm not going to give you a blanket statement, but generally what I recommend doing is figuring out which parts of that product are the absolute key pieces, right? Which pieces, if you could only have one function of it, are the most important piece. Can you take that and build that into the new technology, even if it is just the one piece, the one object that they do each day that your users use, and prove that this new technology is in fact better. And while you're there, figure out the best way of implementing that piece. Because there's nothing worse than deciding that you're going to move on to some new technology and then deciding that you're going to just simply replicate the old product and put that into the new product. What you should be doing is taking that opportunity, this chance to rewrite your entire product, to test and make sure that you're actually building the right stuff. So take that sliver that you think is the most useful, validate it, find out the best way to implement that, and launch that. And perhaps you actually have, one piece of the product that has the best bits, the most user-friendly bits built in the best technology available to customers here as part of a beta program or launched to a small segment of your users. And then once you've proven that that actually works, start porting over different pieces of it. Eventually, you'll find that you'll have most of your product in the new technology, but vastly improved. And it might just be things like, the niggly ends of the configuration and the settings that still exist in the old version before you're able to port those over and kill the old version. So don't miss the opportunity of rewriting your product in this new tech by not taking the time to find out what you could iterate on that user experience. By doing so, you might actually realize that the scope of this new version of the product doesn't have to be nearly the same of what the old version was. You might actually find that you can kill a whole bunch of features that turns out no one was using, as opposed to just assuming you rewrite the whole thing and end up with the same product but just a new tech, which isn't really progress.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got a new question here. A feature-based backlog is already being developed. What questions would you recommend that we ask ourselves to ensure that we create a lean roadmap before it's too late?
That's another good question. I'm just going to read it out and make sure that I fully understand it. So if you've got a feature-based backlog that you're already building from, what I generally recommend is that you take a step back and start asking questions about the things that you're lining up for your next sprint. And whether you're working in sprints or in mini waterfalls or whether you think they're the same thing, it doesn't matter. But find a breakpoint that you can stop what's being fed into development, take a look at what's going into it, and make sure that you've got a time to check that you're actually building the right thing, right? Send it through a discovery track where you do some user testing on the work that you think is going to be built next and make sure that it is the right thing. Test and iterate on that, make a prototype or create a small version that could be launched to a small group of people before you turn around and start putting more stuff in. So even if you do have this big pile of features that have been promised and lined up for the backlog, you always have that option to stop before it goes into development and make sure that you actually are building the right stuff. A lot of people worry about stopping that train and not launching features for a couple of weeks while they double check and make sure that they're building the right stuff. But it's certainly better than the alternative, which is spending those several weeks building the wrong stuff and then having to take it out or redo their work or whatever else comes out of that doesn't work for them.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Janet. I've got a couple more questions here, and guys do drop any more questions as they pop into your heads. So here's one. Jana, you said your roadmap is a prototype for your strategy. What do you mean by
that? Really good question. So the roadmap being a prototype for your strategy is a one that came out of just these constant discussions about what a roadmap is. Because when I started as a product manager about 12 years ago, one of the first things I did, I went back to my desk and I said, what is product management? And I found out that product managers are responsible for the product roadmap. So I went back and said, what is a product roadmap? And if you found the Google results for product roadmap, and even today, if you look at the Google results for product roadmap, you end up with a ton of these timeline versions of your roadmap, these Gantt charts. And so I believed that that's what I needed to do, and that's what I ended up starting to build. And it wasn't until quite a while later, to the point of having built a whole bunch of these roadmaps and realizing that time and time again, I was making these plans and making these promises of what needed to go out there, and making these plans and promises to my board and to my bosses and to my team, that I realized that I was making all these promises that couldn't be held, and at the end of the day, I was the one who was looking bad. And fun fact about ProdPad in its early days, I actually digitized a version of that roadmap and created it into the first version of ProdPad. And we noticed within a couple months that it was failing people, because the first thing they wanted to do was carry stuff over. They wanted to say everything that existed in month 1 and 2, I want to copy and move out by 2 months because we didn't deliver anything. So we want to shift everything over. And while we could have looked at a way of doing some sort of like bulk update on that feature and allow people to move everything over, we started digging down to find out what the 5 whys, asking why people were doing that and why they needed to move out the roadmap, and why didn't they just have why did they need that timeline anyways if they were just going to keep moving it. And we realized that the roadmap wasn't there to create this plan. No one wanted it to. It was just that roadmaps had always had this timeline along the top that people assumed they had to have it. So once we took that off, people started wondering, what is a roadmap? What's the point of it? But over time, the conversation around roadmaps has changed. It's less about having that perfect plan and that timeline. It's much more about making sure that you're communicating the strategy. There was a phase that a lot of companies went through of having no roadmaps, but what they ended up doing was building a whole bunch of features that had no cohesive strategy behind them, and ended up with these Frankensteins of a product. And so having the roadmap allows you to have that guidance, that structure for your team. And a lot of people get really precious about their roadmap, particularly if they have made all these promises of dates and times and orders and everything else. And I believe that the roadmap isn't for that. It's meant to be a starting point for a discussion around what's right or what's wrong. If your roadmap is about telling people what your strategy is, it's not a promise of what your strategy is. That strategy might change, but it's a way of you saying, here's what I think it is. Is this right? Is there anything on this roadmap that's missing? Is there anything on this roadmap that's extra? And at the end of the day, that's no different than a paper prototype where you've scribbled out a feature. You've got a new button that you want to add to a page. So you draw it out on a napkin and you say, let's put the button here. And you show that to a customer, and they might say, I don't understand why the button's there, or that's great, can we have another button there? And based on that feedback, you might take that and try a few different iterations and throw those old versions away and come back with higher and higher def versions. That's the value of prototyping, in that you're able to find out the value of something before you commit to all this stuff. And so a roadmap is very similar in that way, in that you're finding out what these big problems to be solved are before you're committing any sort of time or resource to them. You're just checking that these are in fact the right problems to solve. And so in that way, it is very much a prototype for your strategy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dana. I think we're going to take one more question. And to summarize, what makes mature products the hardest to deal with?
Mature products are considerably harder to build for, and this talk actually came out of my frustration with people turning up, usually agile experts or lean experts, turning up and showing people that build, measure, learn diagram and saying, see, you just need to do this. When in reality, if you see that, you nod along, you get it, but when you go back to your office on Monday morning, you go, well, where do I start? Am I building? Am I measuring? Am I learning? In reality, in the course of a product manager's day, we're doing all of the above and trying to figure out where we actually get in there. And so I'm not a big fan of those simplified, oversimplified frameworks saying, here's how to be lean. In reality, when you're building for mature products, you are dealing with existing customers and clients. You've got tech debt, you've got promises that have been made. Not every company can operate without any dates. Sometimes you've got things like Christmas coming up and you have to deliver by then. These are the realities. It's not about necessarily being perfectly nimble and lean. That is unrealistic for most companies. Very few companies have this ability to be so nimble they can test something out today and iterate tomorrow. In a slow-moving, risk-averse government product, for example, oftentimes that's illegal. You can't do that kind of thing. And so building for more mature products does make it more difficult. I have one story that I realized that we realized after a couple of years of building ProdPad that made this very clear. When we first launched it, our customers were the best in the world. They were super simple because they were product managers like us who had found us through, the types of places that early adopters find you, right? They were eager to find stuff, and they were also able to put up with a beta product that, frankly, myself and my co-founder had built. And they were great at giving feedback, and they also had much more simple needs. These are people who were looking at ProdPad in 2010 through 2013 sort of thing. But fast forward to 2015, 2016, some of those same customers are actually with us today, or were with us then and are with us today. But over the course of those years, those customers have different needs. They're more advanced users. They have grown their companies. They've grown their needs. They have learned how to use ProdPad as is and are hungry for more advanced features as well. But at the same time, we still have even more customers joining each day, and we still have to build this new product to onboard these new customers each day. So even for a product that is arguably quite simple, as ProdPad is not considered a massively mature product, or certainly wasn't back then. At that point in time, we realized that we're still dealing with major differences in cohorts of users, just separated by a couple of years of usage. And so imagine what that's like for companies who have hundreds of thousands of users, some of which are brand new and just started using it that day, some of which have been there for 10 years, other ones which are naturally Luddites, other ones which are naturally early adopters. All these different cohorts have to be built for, and the more customers you attract, the more likely you are to have wide-ranging different cohorts of users to consider, and you do have to build for all of them or pick which ones you are going to focus on.
Cool, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Janet. I hope you all enjoyed that and found it useful. As I said at the start, the recording will be sent through to you early next week. And also watch your inbox to be invited for a one-on-one roadmap clinic with one of the team here. So that might be useful to build on this. So thank you very much, Janet.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's been great talking to you. Thank you. Bye.